Welcome to Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, or CXC 2021. Our 4-day celebration of cartoon art couldn't happen without our partner organizations, to whom we are grateful. CXC is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our annual festival, free to the public, relies on corporate and grant support, as well as individual donations. We are grateful for their support. Visit the Support CXC link on our website to find out how you can help us create meaningful connections between the people who make comics and those who read them. Cartoon Crossroads Columbus acknowledges that the ancient ancestors of the Eastern Woodlands tribes, now referred to as the Adena and Hopewell cultures, inhabited the land we know as Ohio. Their descendants include the living nations of the Shawnee, Miami, Wyandotte, Delaware, and Seneca Coyaga. We honor and respect the diverse indigenous peoples connected to this place where we gather. We hope that you enjoy the event. Don't forget to visit our virtual expo at cartooncrossroadscolumbus.org and keep the conversation going in our Discord channel, which you can find at cartooncrossroadscolumbus.org/Discord.
Hi, everybody. I'm speaking with Jay Hosler, a biology professor and creator of The Way of the Hive and the Sandwalk Adventures, amongst other graphic novels and comic strips. I'm Mike Cavender, and on behalf of Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to chat with us today.
Hello, Columbus. I lived there for 4 years and loved it. We miss it.
Yeah, so that actually brings me to the first thing I have on here. So can you tell us about the work that you did as a postdoc researcher for OSU?
Sure. So my postdoc work was at the Rothenbuehler Honeybee Lab, which is on Waterman Farm. It's no longer a honeybee lab. Now, I didn't break it. It left a couple of years after I went. But the work I did there focused on how honeybees learn odors, specifically floral odors, and how they use that information they learn to communicate where a flower is and how the high quality or the relative quality of the nectar it produces. And I studied some interesting little wonky behavioral elements about how certain odors can interfere with learning of other odors. So I spent a lot of time blowing odors into the face of honeybees and giving them little drops of sucrose as a reward.
Okay. So did you start working on Way of the Hive while you were at OSU, or was that after?
It was. So Way of the Hive was originally published as Clan Apis. And it was originally published in black and white as a series of sort of floppy comics. And it was really in the sort of the preparation for my postdoc. So I just finished my PhD at the University of Notre Dame, and I was reading a book on honeybees to prepare myself for the postdoc. And I kept thinking to myself, oh man, this would be a great story. This would be a great comic. Oh. And it's a testament to how thick-headed I am that it didn't occur to me that maybe I could write that story at some point. And it was the first year of my postdoc. So we were in Columbus for about 4 years. It was in that first year I applied for a Xeric Award. Now the Xeric doesn't exist anymore, but it was essentially a foundation started by Peter Laird, one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle guys. And it was to provide small grants to help independent comic creators publish their books. So I submitted a grant to the Xeric Foundation to get about $1,500 to print the first chapter, the first floppy of Clan Apis. I found out I had also submitted a grant to the National Institutes of Mental Health that was going to pay for my salary and research for 3 years. So it was a very big grant. The Xeric grant was $1,500. I found out about both grants in the same week, and I think I was more excited about the $1,500 from Peter Laird to publish my honeybee book.
Yeah, so why the name change from Clan Apis to The Way of the Hive?
Yeah, so The Way of the Hive was picked up by HarperCollins, and I've worked with some really great people there, Andrew Arnold, Rose Plurler. And, one of the concerns was, well, frankly, one that I'd seen most of the time, most of the 20 years of its life, which is, how do you pronounce this? So is it Apis?
I was actually going to ask that.
Apis,
Yeah.
And if you're going for a book for kids, you probably want it to be pronounceable right off the bat. So we pinged around for a long time. I have to say that of all the work and editing that went into that book, the thing that took us the longest was finding, a title that captured a certain sense of the adventure, a certain sense of the content and the story nature, without seeming too cheeky or too boring. It's I find titles very difficult, and I was very, very glad that we landed on this.
Where along in the process did the title change come?
Well, it was something right off the bat.
Yeah.
So HarperCollins said, "Oh man, we really love this, and we have to change the title."
So HarperCollins didn't come in until 20 years after the publication,
right.
first issue or whatever, right?
Yeah. So, right. And I should have been more clear on that. We self-published Clan Apis for about 20 years, and it was probably for the last, I don't know, 5, 10, 7 years. It has been available as print on demand through Amazon. So you could get it, but it wasn't quite as easy. It wasn't in color. And so, this opportunity to go with a big publisher and be in color and really probably penetrate some markets we hadn't quite penetrated yet was pretty exciting.
All right. So I just read Way of the Hive last week. So I also read that you are self-taught, and that kind of surprised me because you seem to have like a grasp of how comics really work. You're not just drawing like big static images with like blocks of text. There's like storytelling and dynamic panel work and all that stuff. Did you find yourself when you first started out like you understood that that's how the comic should look, or was that something that you kind of found along the way?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The thing is, I've sort of been reading comics. Well, I have been reading comics since Marvel Team Up number 19, Spider-Man and Khazar, and I picked it up because it had dinosaurs on it, and I love dinosaurs. So I think that maybe was 72, 73, and so I've loved comics since then, and comic strips as well. Even before that, I was going down to the only little bookstore in our little town called Read More, which was really just sort of a paperback store with magazines. But they would occasionally have paperback collections of Charlie Brown strips. So even before I was deep into, comic books, I was deep into comic strips. And, when you start with Charles Schulz, who was a master at I think, profound visual storytelling with very simple elements, and then you pick up a comic that was drawn by Gil Kane, those are pretty good places to start to get, examples of storytelling. And then I discovered Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby, and all of those guys had this tremendous power to convey information and ideas and excitement visually. So, that was the material I was sort of weaned on. That was the background material that was always sort of floating in my mind. And so I had very specific ideas of what I thought a comic should look like. And the truth is, I also find most explanatory comics not so interesting for the very reasons you say. Images, blocks of texts. I think one of the things things that is sort of problematic, or we run the risk of making explanatory or science-related comics, whatever, is having them be just richly illustrated textbooks, right? there are plenty of richly illustrated textbooks out there. The thing that I would like, I hope, the thing that I do because it's interesting is tell stories, because that's what I'm interested in. That's when I learn things. That's when I am engaged, when I'm having a story told to me.
So it's funny that you bring up the Marvel team up issue, because I've read several interviews with you recently, and you always bring up Stegron the Dinosaur Man. And so I was wondering, is that like a lifelong favorite character, or did that character just make an impression on you back then?
It's hard not to love a guy who has Stegosaurus plates and big old spikes down his tail. I mean, how could you not just... Now, lately they've drawn him like he's a bulked up, monster, but he was originally, he was originally drawn by Gil Kane, and then eventually in The Amazing Spider-Man, he appeared, I think, most frequently drawn by Ross Andru, where he was, a little more lithe. And I really, I loved that character. If I had to pick a favorite character, a favorite superhero, it's going to be Spider-Man. And if I had to pick a favorite villain, it would be Dr. Octopus. But I think Stegron and the Lizard are two really close seconds, because there was, I had a period in my life where I wanted to be a paleontologist and where I loved lizards. And so those two are also near and dear to my heart.
Excellent. Well, I wanted to go back to something that you had mentioned earlier, and Philip Laird's involvement with getting The Way of the Hive, or Clan Apis at the time, up off the ground. Did you have any interaction with him ever, or any stories about him?
Not really. I emailed him a couple times. I think, to say thank you, and I obviously sent him copies of the book. And he said some really nice things in those emails. And, honestly, when you're a cartoonist and you're creating an independent comic book about bees that a handful of people will probably ever read, to hear Peter Laird or read some nice comments from Peter Laird, that's the type of thing that really buoys you. So although I haven't had, much interaction with him at all, I have fond memories of the limited interactions we've had.
Yeah. Well, Philip Laird, and then you have Neil Gaiman did the blurb on the cover of the latest printing here.
That's right.
So that's got to be nice, right?
It was. My wife and I met Neil Gaiman at a small press expo. It must have been 96. Yeah, probably 96, 97. I'm not sure what year he was a guest. Let's see. Well, it could have been 99, because I think my wife Lisa was pregnant with my first son. And we were sitting at the table. It was late in the day, I think on a Saturday. And I heard the voice of Chris Orr, who I think at the time was the head of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. And he had, people, when they're giving someone a tour, have a very specific kind of voice. And so it sounded like he was giving someone a tour. I looked up, and there he was walking Neil Gaiman around. And to our ever-loving surprise, he stopped at our table. And he started telling Neil Gaiman, "Oh my gosh, you've got to read this frickin' book about frickin' bees," except he didn't say frickin'. And my wife and I said, "Hi, Mr. Gaiman." And our voices cracked. "You can have anything you want." And so, again, very limited interaction with him. He was very gracious, very kind, but obviously hadn't read the book, couldn't make a comment on it. And then a couple weeks later, we would get orders for the book. For Diamond to ship, and orders jumped up massively, and we didn't know what was going on. So it was early internet, and so I decided to go poking around to see if I could figure out, if the book had been mentioned someplace that I'd missed in a vanity search. Not that I did vanity searches every day, but I did vanity searches every day.
Sure.
And I found this online comic convention or comic chat room at Forbidden Planet. And Neil Gaiman was asked at one point what your favorite comic was. And he said Clan Apis by Jay Hosler.
Wow.
which, I mean, at the time. So, it's probably a short window, but that's great.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I reached out and said thank you. And then he had actually recommended it a couple times on his blog to kids that were interested in beekeeping, because Gaiman actually got into beekeeping. Not because of my book, but I think, he just happened to. And that pull quote is from one of the posts in which he recommended that to somebody. All
right. So I wanted to say that I really enjoy your style, and your bees are expressive and somewhat cartoony, but they still have like a certain amount of realism to them. And I wanted to know if this was a conscious decision, or was it like, were you trying to aim at certain audiences? Was this like a calculated type of thing? And I asked too because I looked at some of the comics on your website, and like the human figures on there are a little bit more like stylishly exaggerated. So I just wondered what the thought process was and the difference between those approaches.
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is, I think that my goal when I started doing the book was to write and draw something that, if you took the words away, might kind of look like just a bunch of bees interacting. No, there are moments when they're, I draw them in a highly cartoon fashion, sort of essentially standing upright. But for me, in the work that I did and working with insects, I would actually have to have them under the microscope frequently. And I'm always struck by how beautiful I think they are and how otherworldly, right? I mean, here you have humans and these groups of insects that are separated from us by, millions and millions and millions of years, hundreds of millions of years of evolution. So that they're essentially quite alien to us. We have a skeleton inside, theirs is on the outside. We have camera eyes. They have an eye with 1,000 pixels on each one. They're really weird and otherworldly. And so I wanted to tell a story that had them being themselves as much as I could with anthropomorphized bees. So the goal was to make it as realistic looking as I'm able. So that meant no Disney camera eyes, that I was going to go with, or at least attempt to do eyes that were more reflective of compound eyes. The one thing about those bees, about insects, is they don't have our rubbery faces. They can't be super expressive. And so part of the challenge there was that you do have to have characters that appear to express emotion at some point, I think, in order for readers to engage with them. And so I figured out little tricks like their antenna are eyebrows. And so I can use them, to do weird things, popping up and down. The curve of their mouth, if I have their head down like this, the curve of their upper lip can look like a smile. I could have their antenna standing straight up to indicate surprise. So it took a little experimentation to sort of find ways to make those rigid exoskeletons expressive. But in the end, I think that's my goal has always been to sort of respect the bees as bees. And then in terms of the target audience, I will use the phrase that every publisher has told me never to use, which is all ages. And when I say all ages, I'm sort of thinking a Warner Brothers cartoon, right? So if I watched a Bugs Bunny cartoon with my dad, he would laugh at the wordplay that I might lose or miss when I was 6 or 7, but I would laugh at the slapstick. He would also laugh at the slapstick. But an all ages cartoon like that was something that you could appreciate young, you could appreciate old. And so the other thing kind of going through my mind, because I was writing this book, on the eve of our first child being born, was to make a book that I would like to read to them. so that an adult would like to read to their kids. And so that's always been the target.
So you touched on this a little bit with your answer there, but I was wondering, what is it about insects that kind of grabbed you, and was that something that happened to you when you were a kid, or did you come across that a little bit later on? Like because when you were in undergrad and stuff, you weren't initially into etymology, or is that correct? Or
so yeah, when I was in college, I was a biology major. Actually, my undergraduate research, I did a little bit of plant stuff, not very well. And then when I moved to graduate school, what I was really interested in doing was physiology study, how organ systems work. Specifically, I was interested in the nervous system. So how excitable tissues like your nerves, your muscles, how they work. And I joined a lab that actually used insects to explore that, because their nervous system works in a very similar way. And they can actually learn things in a similar way to the way we do. So they're terrific model systems. And so I sort of got my introduction to insects in graduate school. And one of the things I felt was important was that if I was going to use an organism as a physiological model system, I should understand that organism's basic biology. So I started doing, a fair bit of reading in insects in general, and I was working with honeybees and little fruit flies called Drosophila melanogaster. And it was just one of those things where, for me at least, the more I read, the more fascinated I became in terms of how they worked. And for me, I think, and I've said this before in other places, the story of insects offers a really unique, two unique components when you tell the story. The first is, and I was told this by a children's librarian named Robin Brennan, was that they offer both sort of a mirror and a window. So you can look at insect society, you can look at honeybees, and you can see a mirror to your own existence. You can see an organism that has a mother, a father, siblings, an organism that has to worry about finding food, surviving dangers, et cetera, right? So those are things that we can relate to a certain extent. So that's a mirror, but it also provides an opportunity to show the reader a window into a different world. So, honeybees live in a hive composed of wax. Where does the wax come from? Well, they secrete it. So they're living on a home built from their own bodily secretions. The kind of wax is similar to the earwax that you have. So if you can imagine deciding you want to have a home and you start digging out earwax every morning, sort of collect materials, this is the world that they live in. And like I said, they've got 6 legs and wings, and we've got 4 fleshy, appendages and a skeleton on the inside. I mean, so there's this opportunity in terms of storytelling to have an organism like bees that are enough like us that we can relate to them, and different enough that we can make them really intriguing.
So speaking of storytelling, you start off the way the Hive with like a bee-centric creation myth. Mm-hmm. I was hoping maybe that you could kind of tell us how you came across that approach to start off the book, because it might seem somewhat counterintuitive to start off what is essentially a science text with a creation myth, but it's very powerful and it really draws you into the story overall.
I think that I'm fascinated by the stories we tell each other. So I think that if you look at almost any of my books, somebody in every one of my books is telling somebody a story. And sometimes those stories tell us a lot about who we are and how we see the world. So it was interesting to me, if I was going to create this world of honeybees, to explore the idea of, how it is they think everything came to be. And of course, from their perspective, the world started with a flower. And they were essentially the chosen to take care of that flower, to be stewards. But the other thing that story allowed me to do was lay the foundation for where bees sort of sit in the grand scheme of things, right? So we can start very broadly with the creation of the cosmos, and then the start of life on Earth, the evolution of that life, the fact that there are a whole bunch of different types of insects, and then we can sort of zero in on our honeybees. When you're writing the introduction to a scientific paper, right? So a scientific paper has an opening section called the introduction, and then another section called the materials and methods, the results, and then the discussion of those materials and methods. But when we teach our kids to write the introduction, you write it as a funnel. So you start very broadly, and with each successive paragraph, you get more and more specific till you get to the point where you're sort of explaining your hypothesis. So in some respects, not only does that story give us a sense of how the bees view themselves, but it works as a funnel to provide this broader context for life in the universe as we zoom down and look in this one particular type of organism.
Right. So obviously you're passionate about comics, but also, teaching. Can you tell us how you first got the idea to use comics as a teaching tool?
Sure. So my dad was a 6th grade teacher, and then he became a middle school guidance counselor. My mom was a social worker, and she started working for the same school system I'm in as a social worker. And so I'm surrounded by teachers. My aunts and uncles are teachers. And so teaching was always something, for whatever reason, was going to be part of my life. And for me, finding ways to explain things has always been sort of an important thing to figure out, in large part because I need things explained to me. And I knew the ways in which explanations worked best for me. So, my kids are probably 3 or 4 times smarter than I am. They pick up things really easily. For me, it's a little more of a grind, and it helps me to imagine abstract ideas when I have an image, or I can create or visualize something. And there's a whole bunch of data that now suggests clearly that using images and drawings frees up working memory when you're trying to figure out a problem. It helps consolidate the idea of models and complex systems for students better. And so, I found myself always, even as a graduate student who's explaining things, always drawing on the board, always, writing down things, drawing sketches for students at office hours. One of the things, though, that let me say it like this. So I got this one thing over here, right? We'll put a pin in that, drawing pictures to explain things. And in lectures, I routinely spent time telling stories, right? I would create a metaphor to explain the central dogma of biology, or I would tell the story of how a particular scientist, through serendipity and good luck, figured out this problem, right? And those, for me, were always very compelling moments of lectures and classes when stories were being told. So we'll put a pin in that. And then for me, as someone who loved comics, if I knew that pictures were really important and stories were really important, what happens when I put the pictures and the stories together? And so for me, having the power or having the ability, because I had been cartooning through college and graduate school, having that ability to maybe put pictures and words together and then put all of that information within the context of some sort of narrative where you had characters cracking jokes or having ridiculous things happen to them. All of that in my mind suggested something that would be very compelling for a student like me. And I never really felt that I was that much different from most students. So I figured if it worked for me, then there was a good chance that it would work for other people.
Oh, at what point did that move into move in out of the classroom and into like publishing graphic novels or comics?
Yeah, so I think the comics came first, right? So I think that I started making those comics when I was a postdoc, before I was even really teaching on a regular basis. One of the things that I was struck by when I started teaching, so when I got the position here at Juniata College in 2000, one of the things I was struck by was the intimidation that maybe some non-major students felt. So, right, lots of colleges have a requirement. You've got to take one science course, one math course, right? And for some reason, these are the courses where kids go in, they say, I hate science. I can't do science. I can't do math. Okay, that's horse crap. I mean, everybody can. You can say you don't want to. That's a different thing. But everyone can. But what you have to do is you have to get people to the point where they want to, right? And this is, to me, the big thing about students. I mean, if we walk in and say, if I walk into a class and say, you are going to come to me, I am the sage on the stage, you are the morons, and you're going to have to come meet me here. Well, that's no way to teach. I mean, you wouldn't parent that way, right? And at this age, at my age, most of these kids are my kids' age. I wouldn't parent that way. I would do whatever I could to coax and cajole and show them that something is really cool and pique their interest. And that's exactly what I try to do with my comics. So I got a grant from the National Science Foundation to create a non-majors textbook for my sensory biology class. When we tested it, we tested to see the class before we used the comic and then after we used the comic. And we assessed them on a couple of things. You know, their basic knowledge of some biology. We assessed them on their attitude about comics. Did they like comics? Did they hate comics? And we assessed them on their attitudes about biology. And they didn't, this is going to come as a shock, these non-majors did not like biology. You know what? They also did not like comics. They thought comics were for people who were not very smart. And they didn't do very well on the overall assessment. So I used this non-majors comic book, comic textbook. It was called Optical Illusions, and you can get it for free off my website if you're curious in seeing what it looks like. And then 2 weeks after we finished that, we gave them the same assessments. Do you like biology? Do you like, comics? And what do you know about the content? And their content knowledge rose significantly, statistically significantly, actually. As did their attitude about biology and comics. They suddenly thought biology was pretty okay, and the comics weren't so bad either. And that attitude, the biology and comics attitude were roughly correlated and connected. So I think that there was we published that work in CBE Life Science Education. And I think that there was absolutely something about the comics and the contextualizing of the information. I mean, look, nobody likes to learn lists. And we have been guilty in education, science education, I think, although it's much, much better in the last 10, 20 years, of teaching lists. And I can't remember lists, but I can remember stories. I can remember systems. And so I think that for me, the comics came first, and then it became clear how their application could benefit my students.
Great. When you're working on making a comic, do you, because you talk so much about, kind of visual learning, especially in this, with the sequential art format, do you start with a script first, or do you kind of doodle stuff out, and how do you work?
Yeah, so for me, it's always the story first. For me, so I some people, I see their sketchbooks and they're glorious. They're beautiful. They're works of art. They're a reason why some people can publish their sketchbooks and people will buy them. No one would buy my sketchbooks. My sketchbooks are profoundly boring. because my art has always been sort of in service of my stories. And so I'm getting to the point where I can draw most of the stuff I want to draw, but the things I want to draw always spring first from the story. And so I have to decide what it is I'm going to tell a story about. And the truth is, it first starts with thoroughly overlearning everything I can, or as much as I can, till my brain gets full of a particular topic. So before I started The Way of the Hive, Clan Apis, I read 10 books on honeybees. And it was way more information than I would ever use. But it also helped me build sort of a world in my head, and get a sense of the type of relationships and the important points that I wanted to talk about. And then what you have to do, or what I have to do, I think, is come up with a story that works its way around the science, and not a story in which I bend the science to my will, right? One of the things I always think about is Bug's Life. Bug's Life. They go into that town, right? So it's a remake of Magnificent Seven, which is a remake of Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. And they go into I think a bar at some point, and I think the aunt Flick is standing at the bar, and this mosquito comes up. And in a drunken slur, says, "Give me some, I don't know, A positive," something like that. And, for me, when I first saw that movie, I don't know what it's called, like when the records goes screech, because I'm sitting there going, well, let's see. Males don't drink blood. Mosquitoes don't drink blood, right? So that, to me, seems like a really simple thing to get right. Mm-hmm. And then I think that it would be just as funny to have a female voice drunkenly asking for some blood. And that was one of those situations where I won't say they were bending the science to their needs, but they were careless. And I don't get everything right either. But what I want to do is construct a story so that as much of the accurate natural history can come spinning out of it. In the same way that a good historical novelist will get their time period and the interactions of certain characters, even though they're fictional. Again, I'm like my father now. I have about 4 stories that I tell over and over again. But I once read a Smithsonian article on how samurai swords were made, and how you fold the metal, et cetera, et cetera. And I couldn't really follow it. I didn't understand what meant to fold metal. And then I picked up a copy of Usagi Yojimbo, which is, it's about a samurai rabbit, but everything that he has written in there gives you an insight into culture in Japan at the time. So it is in that sense accurate. And he had a sequence, a 2 or 3 page sequence on how a samurai sword was made. And there I saw how they folded the metal. So that's sort of the approach that I like to take with the science in the comics. I think I strayed off the question there. Sometimes that happens.
Still great. You bring up Usagi Yojimbo. That's great.
Well, I'm starting to feel my 54 years as I kind of dodderingly wander off into the backyard, wondering why I'm there.
Sure.
I appreciate your patience.
Oh, no problem. I have another question about process. So you usually write and draw your comics, but in one occasion you teamed up with some artists. Was that the plan all along for that project? Do you prefer working one way to the other?
So that was the book Evolution, and that was with Xander Cannon and Kevin Cannon. That book was a sequel to The Stuff of Life, in which Xander and Kevin had drawn the story written by Mark Schultz. And the publisher wanted to do another one. They wanted to do it on Evolution. I don't think Schultz was available. I had known Xander for a long time, since my SPX days. I think he suggested me. And, I'm a huge admirer of Xander Cannon and Kevin Cannon. They are amazing storytellers and amazing artists. So having an opportunity to work with Xander, who I'd already known and knew him then as the creator of the Replacement God, I'm like, oh, absolutely, I'll do it. It was a different process, but and this is meant as no insult to them, they have similar sensibilities to me. So they, there wasn't a lot of explaining about what I was imagining for scripts. And so I found it to be really effortless to work with them because they were so great. And of course, then my wife likes to laughingly comment that it is the best looking book I've ever done. She's a mean person.
Right.
But the truth is, honestly, if I had to pick, I really love the drawing. And so for me, they did that book, I think, better than I could have done that book for what I was imagining, because I would never imagine something that I couldn't draw, which sort of boxes me in a little bit. So I could imagine a 2-page spread of dinosaurs, which, they pulled off miraculously, that it wouldn't have looked as good if I had done it. And so, but given the chance, I really love to draw.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One last question about process. So for this edition of The Way of the Hive, it's colorized, and so you brought on Hillary Sycamore to do the colors.
Right.
Can you tell us about the decision to do that and how she was brought onto the project?
Yeah. So Andrew Arnold, he asked for a couple, handful of sort of sample pages that then he sent around to colorists. And then, these colorists would send samples to us and he would forward them along. And, Hillary, she was just she was in another league in terms of the other things I said. So there was really no competition in terms of what I saw. We had really minimal sort of interaction. We talk, but I made a few initial comments about color on certain elements of the honeybees, but after that, there was really very little I had to say. She has a great sense of the palette. She has a great intuitive sense of what the bees and their natural environment look like. So there was very little work on my part, and a tremendous amount of satisfaction. Right?
Yeah, it's a gorgeous book.
Those pages coming in.
In the back of The Way of the Hive in your bio, you mentioned being into Godzilla movies.
Oh, yes.
My son and I actually just watched like every Godzilla movie that's out there.
Right.
Do you have a favorite Godzilla movie or comic?
Oh, I'll tell you. So I'm glad you're watching with your son. In the old days when Netflix was still, you'd get a disc in the mail.
Oh, yes.
Right. So when my kids were in middle school, every Saturday we would watch a different Godzilla movie. And my kids were connoisseurs. They wanted it in the Japanese with the subtitles. So I had to read every movie out loud before they could actually read. And we would drink orange cream sodas. So it's a tremendous memory for me. But if I had to pick a favorite, it's absolutely the original King Kong versus Godzilla. And there are reasons for that. It has a giant octopus in it, which that right there is more than enough to put it over the edge. But when I was growing up in Huntington, Indiana, we had it's not little, it was a decent sized theater downtown. And during the summer, they had Saturday matinees that were for, a quarter. And I remember watching that movie in the balcony and just thinking it was the most amazing bit of cinema I had ever seen in my life. and I have to tell you that I'll pick up the Godzilla figures, and my very favorite Godzilla figure is the original King Kong versus Godzilla.
Absolutely. That's actually the one that I started off watching with my son. That was the first one we watched, and he was hooked. And I was like, all right, well, we'll just start watching all these, and eventually got through all of them.
I think that it was the first color one, right? I think it's the only. I think it was
because it's the third one. Yeah. Because the original and then Godzilla Raids Again, both black and white. Yeah.
So now the key is, with the original one, did you get the original Gojira, or did you get the Raymond Burr Pieces American version?
The original for sure. Okay. Much better. Yes, much better film, I would say. No slide on Raymond Burr.
Raymond Burr was great as Perry Mason.
Sure.
Not so good as a Godzilla commentator.
Right. So what comics are you into right now? What are you reading?
Wow, that's a great question. I've been reading Kaiju Max. So probably no surprise there, given my affinity for Kaiju and Xander Cannon. Usagi Yojimbo has been on my pull list since forever. I think I have almost all of them, starting back in the old Fantagraphic days. I buy a lot of graphic novels now. I think much more than floppies. And in some cases, that's, waiting till, floppies come out. But gosh, I'm trying to remember what the last one I read was that I really liked. There've been a handful. Oh my goodness, I can't remember the name now. It's Once Upon a Time in France, and it's a French album about a guy who helped a lot of individuals in France. A lot of Jews escape Nazi problems, but he also sort of towed the line between that and being a conspirator. And so it was really fascinating, beautifully illustrated book. I think that's the most recent really big book that I read that I really liked.
Great. Are you working on any projects right now?
Yeah. So we have a book coming. I have a book coming out next year called Santiago. It's going to come out from Holiday House. And it's a story of Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who's Spain's greatest scientist. And he's sort of the father of modern neuroscience. But I sort of spend almost all of the book really focuses on his life as a kid. So Cajal, his contribution was that he was an histologist. So in other words, he would slice up tissues and stain them with various stains so you could see the cells. And before him, there was some controversy as to how the nervous system was put together. Was it a network of tubes, sort of like the circulatory system, where everything was connected in one great big net? Or was the nervous system made up of individual cells that could change? And his research showed us that it was individual cells. And that explains a lot, because individual cells can grow new connections or prune connections, and that's how you learn. Now, that said, the actual science there is not probably the stuff of great storytelling. But his life as a child is, because what Cajal wanted to be more than anything was an artist. And his dad said, no, you got to be a doctor like me. And Cajal, he figured out a way to be both. So he became a doctor. He never really practiced. He became a professor of anatomy. And all of the skills that he developed as a young kid. So he had tricks for his parents would prohibit him from having pencils, pens, inks, paints, brushes. But he would find a way to extract pigments from the covers of cigarette paper books so that he could create watercolor paints. He was so clever once he created his own gunpowder because he built a cannon. He was this tremendous energy, a tremendous engine of creativity. And he did so much in terms of training himself to create the tools and to actually master being an artist. And in the end, those skills of creating dyes and painting and staining are what he used at the microscopic level. He effectively painted the tissues of the brain. And because he was so skilled at it, he was capable of seeing the nervous system in a way that no one had ever seen it before. And so the story is really about his childhood and how everything that he learned to become an artist ultimately contributed to him being a Nobel Prize winning scientist.
Excellent. So I have one last question for you.
Okay.
And we may have some overlap here with your prior response there. But I'm sure everybody always asks you like who your favorite comic creators are, which is a great question. But I wanted to see if you could tell us who your favorite scientists are.
Yeah. So Cahal is one.
I figured.
Because not that I'm anywhere in his league, but at least we're thinking about the same things, science and art. Darwin is the other because he told an uncomfortable truth at a time when it was absolutely not popular to do so. But what he saw, his vision of how life on Earth had changed, revolutionized the way we think about biology. And so, he did not want to be the center of attention. He did not want to be conspicuous. He didn't want anyone to think that he was trying to tear down society. And yet he ultimately did, because he didn't tear down society, but he fundamentally shifted the way in which the world looks at biology. And I think that when you see biology as a study of an ever-changing world, it's sort of this amazing, exciting, dynamic world all of a sudden, and not just a world of, okay, we got rhinos over here, check, and we got elephants over here, check. Now we can start thinking about, where did rhinos come from? Where did elephants come from? That to me that's a pretty exciting door to have opened for science. Those are my two biggies. And then Barbara Mcclintock. Barbara Mcclintock, Nobel Prize winning plant geneticist. She was absolutely one of these singular individuals who, for many years, was laughed at for some of her theories. She posited that genes might be jumping around, and they were called jumping genes. And she could make these sort of assessments based upon this painstaking work that she did. But of course, it sounded silly. It was unorthodox, and she got laughed at for it. But in the end, she was right. And she uncovered this sort of bizarre form of just sort of genetic movement of materials within cells. And so, like I said, she's another person who knew the right answer. It wasn't orthodox, but she stuck to her guns. And I totally admire that. I'm not sure I would have her courage, actually.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's all I have for you tonight. Wanted to thank you for coming on. Thanks, Rich, for running the show behind the scenes.
Nice job, Rich.
You got it. Thanks, guys.
Did you have anything else you wanted to add, Jay?
Not off the top of my head. Just, it was really nice talking to you, Mike. You asked really good questions.
Oh, thank you.
It was an absolute pleasure to listen to you, buddy.
Oh, wow. Thanks. I wish my students felt that way.
They should.
Okay. Well, on behalf of Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, thanks for coming on. Everybody go and check out The Way of the Hive.
Absolutely.
It's a great book. I highly recommend it. And maybe we'll see you in Columbus sometime, Jay.
I hope so. I love the place. I'll be back as soon as I can.
All right. Thanks.
All right. We'll see ya.
See ya.